by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 13. It lasted for a week, the peace and the bliss. A week in which, as it happened, no one of the McLaughlin family discovered that the prodigal had returned. It was during that week that young Ken McLaughlin, in a fury of despair over the loss of his colt, stood on the top of Castle Rock and hurled down the cherished stopwatch which was to have timed the future racer. At the end of the week, Goblin left the herd of yearlings and drifted south again. His terror had changed, as all terror should, into knowledge and acceptance of a danger, a lesson learned, and those mountains down there exerted an irresistible fascination over him. He went more slowly than before. He spent a week grazing with a little band of antelope in a dell-like valley on the way, and he explored extensively on both sides of the lower reaches of the river. When at last he reached the rock where he had been attacked by the eagle, it was near the end of July. This time there was no piebald foal lying across in midstream, no monster bird in the air. Goblin spent a half hour by that rock, smelling and snorting, going over every inch of the little beach where he and the eagle had fought. Something like a dried curled branch lay upon it with a darkish clot on the end. He circled it, then reared and came down, pawing at it. He cut it to bits and grounded it into the earth. He followed the torrent upward until he could follow it no longer. It filled the gorge. Streams ran over the sides of the cliff to join it. In the crevices of rock were pockets of snow. The stream was choked with spring floods. It pounded and churned. A dead tree drifting down was hurled tens of feet into the air. Goblin looked at the river a long time. He raised his head. What was beyond? Up there? His nostrils flared. The river and the rock walls were so steep and so high that he could no longer see the sky, only craggy peaks, and ever more of them. But up beyond all that was where he must go. Cows and horses are by instinct expert engineers and will always find the easiest way through a mountainous country. Goblin detoured from the river on the eastern side. He had stiff climbing to do, but there were breaks in the river walls, and running with the broodmares on the saddleback had made him as sure-footed as a goat. Hours of hard going brought him at length to the last grassy terrace before the rocks shot up in an almost sheer cliff. The place was like a park with clumps of pine and rock, little dells and grooves, and, scattered at the base of the cliff and on its summit, numbers of the huge smooth surface stones like the one balanced on the top of Castle Rock on the Goose Bar Ranch. Some of them as large as houses and perfectly smooth and spherical, these boulders are to be found all through the country of the Continental Divide, creating a wonder in the mind of any beholder as to what great glaciers in what bygone age could have ground and polished them and left them at last hanging by a hair on narrow shelves of rock, or balanced on peaks, or suspended above crevices where 1 inch more of space on either side would have freed them to go crashing down. Goblin was hungry. He took his bearings first, then began to graze. Rounding a clump of trees he halted and lifted his head sharply. There, not 100 yards away, close to the base of the cliff wall, were 2 handsome bay colts grazing. Goblin was quiet for a moment, savouring the interest and delight of a meeting with some of his own kind. Then he whinnied and stamped his foot. The colts looked up. With innocent friendliness they trotted towards him. Being a stranger, Goblin had to discover certain things immediately. Were these mares or stallions? Where did they come from? Would they be friends or enemies? So, just as children, meeting, always ask each other, "What's your name? How old are you? Where do you live?" These colts exchanged information, squealing and snorting and jumping about. This was interrupted by a ringing neigh that came, it seemed, right out of the wall of rock. The colts responded immediately. They whinnied in answer and galloped towards the wall, angling off at a place at some distance where a ridge ran jaggedly up the cliff. And then, to Goblin's amazement, they galloped right into the wall and disappeared. Goblin galloped after them. Turning the shoulder on the ridge, he found himself in a narrow chasm which split the rampart of rock and led some distance into the heart of it. There was no sign of the colts, but the passageway was full of the smell of horses. Goblin trotted confidently on. Suddenly there was a harsh scream from above, and the shadow of a wide wings drifted across the chasm. As long as he lived, a moving shadow falling upon him from above would galvanize Goblin into terrified action. He crouched, backing, and his upflung head and straining eyes tried to spy out his enemy. But not by looking could the colts see and apprehend the eagle's eyrie, clinging to a ledge far up on the peak, with one eagle sitting on the edge of the nest and the other, the one-legged eagle, drifting down over the chasm. Colts and eagles live on different planes. Only by the colt's shadow falling on him, only by the scream, with a strange mingling of ferocity and sadness, only by the horror and shuddering within himself, could he know his danger. He plunged forward, driving straight towards the rock which apparently closed the path, but arriving there, the passageway turned. He went on, zigzagging. He saw and heard nothing more of the eagle. At last the sides of the chasm sloped away, exposing a wider wedge of sky, and in front of him was a mass of the great boulders which seemed to have been rolled down the sides, choking the chasm completely. But there was still the smell of horses. Goblin went on, and a turn showed him an open way through, a sort of keyhole, roofed with a single great boulder which hung on slight unevenness on the side walls. Beyond, Goblin glimpsed blue sky and green grass. Galloping through, he came out into brilliant sunlight and a far vista of valley and mountain. Goblin had found his way into the crater of an extinct volcano. 2 miles or more across, and of an irregular oblong shape, the valley was belly deep in the finest mountain grass. Here and there, rocky or tree-covered hills rose from the valley floor, reaching as high as the jagged and perpendicular cliff which ringed it and shut it in. Outside of the crater walls rose still higher mountains, timbered with pole pine and juniper and aspen. On the lower slopes of the stone rampart were narrow ravines in which were close thickets of quake and asp, their roots deep under the rivulets that gathered from 1,000 crevices to pour into the valley and join the broad river that wound across it. Reaching the rampart, the river burst through, changed to a foaming torrent by the compression of the narrow cliff walls. Here, at an altitude of 14,000 feet, was a valley of incomparable richness, unknown to man. Vacationers and climbers are familiar with those ranges, which are close to civilization, but not the inaccessible mountain fastness which stretch for hundreds of miles through the Rockies, lifting their lonely peaks to the clouds and the sun and drifting eagles. Goblin stood motionless, his eyes scanning the valley, his muzzle lifted to suck in and savour and read all the messages it flung at him. He knew much about it already. This was the country that had called him, and he had answered the call. Those horses over there, the big, loosely flung herd, grazing quietly, were the horses he had been hunting. Mares. His nostrils quivered. He neighed loudly. The mares raised their heads. The foals faced around. What magnificent animals! Big, smooth, glossy. The very smell of them was sweet and strong with health and power. The mares were blacks and bays and sorrels, and the colts were the same, except for a few piebalds. Nickering, they lifted their heads and trotted towards the newcomer. Goblin rushed happily to meet them. He was at home with mares. Most of his life had been spent with them. They milled around him, thrilled and excited by the advent of a stranger. He lost all thought of fear or caution in the happiness of having arrived. He met and smelled and talked to them one by one. The squeals and whinnies, the jumps and snorts and playful kickings were all delightful fun. Some of them tried to drive the intruder out, but their bites and kicks were half-hearted. On the summit of a nearby hill stood a great white stallion. He was upwind from his mares, which was fortunate for the goblin. As it was, the albino noticed the commotion in his harem and lifted his head to observe it. This animal stood 16.5 hands high. He was pure white. His body had power and strength rather than gracefulness. He was not smooth. He was gnarled like an old oak tree. His coat was marred by many scars. His great age showed in the hollows of his flanks and shoulders and face. Behind the dark glare of his eye, a blazing fire burned, and on this flame was projected an irresistible willpower and a personality that was like the core of a hurricane. He looked over his kingdom. He had stood there for years, looking over his kingdom, and, if horses think, wondering who would take over when his end came. He had no heir. How could he have? He permitted no colt older than a year to remain in the band of mares, nor any stallion older than a 2-year-old to be in the valley. Here and there, in the deep grass, were the polished bones of those who had challenged him. And if any attempted to return after he had driven them forth, they did not try a second time. When Goblin caught the unmistakable strong scent of the stallion, he trotted out from the herd to find him. He saw him up there on a hill, just where Benno would have been, and with a joyful nicker started towards him. The albino came down to meet him. Goblin, a creature of fire and magnetism himself, felt the oncoming stallion in terms of voltage, and it was almost too much to be borne. Goblin came to a stop. It occurred to him that he was going in the wrong direction, but he held his ground. He watched. He had never seen or felt anything like that before. The stallion was so contained, his power was so gathered and held within him, that he was all curves. His great neck was so arched that his chin was drawn in and under. The crest of his head was high and rounded with long ears, cocked like spear points. His face was terrifying, that ferocious expression, those fiery eyes, and his huge, heavily muscled legs, curving high, flung forward so that the great body floated through the air. Then the massive hoofs striking and pounding upon from the earth with sledgehammer blows that made the hills tremble and echoed like thunder in the valley. The goblin still held his ground. The albino slowed his pace, came closer, stopped. Their noses were about 2 feet apart. For as long as a minute they faced and eyed each other. They were the same, trunk and branch of the same tree, and from that confusing identity, each seeing himself as in a distorted mirror, there flamed terror and fury. No self-respecting stallion would deign to attack a mere yearling, or even to take him seriously enough to administer heavy punishment. But suddenly the albino raised his right hoof and gave one terrible pawing stroke, accompanied by a short grunting screech of unearthly fury. And in doing so he both acknowledged and attempted to destroy his heir. The stroke was delivered with lightning speed. From his great height, if the blow had come down on Goblin's head, as was intended, it would have killed him instantly. But Goblin was endowed with the same speed, and reflexes that acted quicker than thought. He swerved. The great hoof glanced down his neck, ripping the flesh at the shoulder, and sent him rolling. To complete the attack, the stallion dropped nose to earth, turned and lashed with hind feet to catch the body of the colt as he fell from the blow and finish him off. But the goblin rolled too far and too fast, landed on his feet, and whirled to face his antagonist. The stallion plunged towards him, head stretched out like a lethal missile, the twisted mouth open and reaching to bite, the great teeth, like slabs of yellow stone, bared, and in the wild and terrible face 2 eyes blazing like fire opals. The goblin whirled and streaked towards the band of mares. They were bunched, watching, fascinated. They opened their ranks and let him in. They scattered at the impact of the albino's head-on rush. Goblin dodged. He felt the rake of the albino's teeth down his haunch, a chunk bitten out. He squealed and doubled behind another mare. The albino's charge knocked her off her feet and Goblin went down under her. He felt a burning pain in his ear and tore it loose. He was up again, shouldering into a group of mares and foals. When he came out the other side, the albino had lost him for the moment. It was his chance. He fled towards the keyhole in the rampart, albino in thundering pursuit. Entering the passageway, the goblin followed the zigzag path which led through it, and here his smaller size gave him an advantage. Emerging on the other side, the albino was some distance behind, but still coming fast. It was a long chase. Goblin's youth and his quickness at dodging and doubling, and the cover given him by the rocks and clumps of trees, saved him. 6 miles down the river, he was alone at last. As the afternoon light began to fade, he was limping from the painful wound on his shoulder. He carried his head on one side, favouring the torn ear, now and then giving it a little shake to shake the pain away, scattering drops of blood. He ached all over. To move, now that he had stopped running, was an agony. He stood under a tree, twisted and quivering. He ate nothing all night. In the morning he went to the river and drank deeply. The memory of all that had happened was graven in him. He faced the rampart, cocked his one good ear, turned his head until he caught the wind, and stood straining, listening, smelling, bringing to his consciousness, almost as strongly as if he could see him, the terrible monster that had terrified and bested him. He had the impulse to neigh and challenge him, but not the strength nor the courage. Never mind, there would be another day. Wait, he had wounds to heal. Goblin grazed until he had filled his belly and renewed his strength, then took the way home. That's the end of chapter 13.